Hi, my name is Aaron Sampson. In the information age, privacy and security is of paramount importance. We've seen numerous examples of the damage that can be done when information is compromised, and organizations spend vast resources to keep information safe and secure for good reason. In this course, I'll discuss privacy concerns, beginning with the basics of internet and computing privacy. Then I'll explore software and network privacy considerations, security policies and procedures, regulations and considerations for handling information, and password best practices. Finally, I'll examine encryption technologies and the importance of protecting data at rest and in transit. Upon completion, you'll have built the foundation for the basics of IT. This course helps to prepare learners for the CompTIA IT Fundamentals or ITF Plus certification exam FC0 U61. In this video, we'll provide an overview of internet privacy concerns, which primarily involves the collection and storage, use, and dissemination of information pertaining to individuals or other entities. In short, internet privacy is provided in the form of mandates that require personal data that you provide to any entity be stored in a secure fashion, that it be used only by that entity for its intended purpose, and that it not be disseminated to any other entity without your consent. As for the type of information that is usually covered by internet privacy mandates, it typically focuses on personally identifiable information or PII, which refers to any information that can be used to identify an individual or other entity, such as a driver's license or a passport, a social security number or social insurance number, health records, or financial information such as account numbers. But it's not limited to just personal information. It can also include activities such as location information obtained through mobile devices, or the links of a website that you've clicked on, or the options of a site that you've configured. In virtually every case, this information is gathered by an app or a service that is running for the legitimate purposes of providing information that is necessary to someone. For example, even if we discount the internet entirely, if you've ever gone to a doctor's office, you undoubtedly had to fill out a form to provide personal information such as your medical history. But of course, our concern as a patient is that this information is used appropriately and that it remains private. So the same would apply to any information provided to any online entity. Now, in the modern age of information technology, there are two main areas of concern when it comes to privacy: digital privacy and information security. Now, digital privacy is essentially the same as the example of filling out a form at a doctor's office, but of course in an online format. So any personal information that you might provide when you sign up for an online service, such as a streaming entertainment service, is meant to be used only by the provider. And again, they should not disseminate any of your personal information to any other entity. Information security, however, refers to the measures that are in place to protect that information against malicious attack or any type of unauthorized access, including by the internal personnel of the provider. So it's not just about keeping information private, it also has to be kept safe. As for how privacy and security are maintained, again, there are two primary methods. When it comes to information that is transferred between you and an online entity, you should always ensure that the website or app uses secured HTTP or HTTPS as opposed to just HTTP. A publicly available website that uses HTTPS means that there is a digital certificate along with that site, which itself means that the entity has been investigated and vetted by an independent third party, and they've proven that they are who they claim to be, and that they provide the services they claim to provide. Any user can view the information of the certificate as well, usually by clicking on a padlock icon in the address bar of the browser. All sites using HTTPS use encryption to securely transfer data between you and their servers to ensure that it is protected in transit. Once that data has been received, however, such as when you create an account for yourself, that data must be stored by the online entity, so it must also be protected using encryption while it's stored. which is known as data at rest. This ensures that even if an internal employee who is not authorized were to attempt to view your information or even steal the hard disks on which it's stored, they would not be able to access the data. The key considerations with respect to losing data privacy or security include identity theft, which is perhaps the most significant concern, particularly when it comes to financial situations, because someone else who successfully steals your identity could cause significant damage to your reputation and/or your credit rating or profile. The privacy of mobile devices and the apps they contain, which refers to the significant amount of data that is gathered by devices regarding location information, the calls we've made, the sites we've visited, and all information we enter into the apps we install, all of which could potentially be used maliciously if obtained by an unauthorized person, which of course is much more likely to happen with a mobile device since they're so frequently lost or stolen. If we were all still limited to desktop computers, far less of this information would be attainable so easily. And social media sites where we, of course, voluntarily provide personal information, so do be mindful of what information you post, because like anyone or anything else, the security of the social media provider isn't 100% effective. But again, even if their measures were 100% effective, there might still be a significant amount of personal data that we're posting that is publicly available to just about anyone. So be sure to remain mindful of what information you do post. So while online providers are mandated to maintain data privacy and security, there are still options that we as users can implement to increase the security of our online activities, including using payment services such as Google Pay, Apple Pay, or PayPal, as opposed to supplying credit card information directly each time a purchase is made. Use a VPN service, which establishes a secured encrypted session between the provider and your device first before going online. Then all activity occurs through the VPN provider, as opposed to directly on the internet. Use safe browsing features such as in private or dark mode browsing, which disables tracking features and storing of personal information in the browser. And use third-party, non-tracking search engines and browser extensions. Now, to finish up, while these tips can certainly help to maintain data privacy and security, the data that is collected by any given online entity is, of course, out of our control once we have provided it. So it's always important to do your best to ensure that the entity you're dealing with is authentic and reputable. And if there is any doubt, then no information should be provided at all, at least not without doing some additional research as to their legitimacy. In this video, we'll outline the expectation for privacy with respect to using social media sites, the use of which has proliferated tremendously since they first emerged, to the point where they've become virtually integrated with our daily lives. And while they can provide us with useful information and the ability to more easily communicate, they also represent an inherent and ongoing battle between shared information and privacy concerns. And this, of course, is due to how easy it is to share personal information these days. For instance, something as seemingly innocuous as posting a comment about the restaurant you just went to reveals your location information, as well as some of your preferences, which over time can be used to build up a more comprehensive profile of your activities and behaviors. So, in short, of course, there is always some information that you want to share, but there can also be information that is shared unwittingly, which doesn't really mean that it was shared by the provider without your knowledge, simply that sometimes information can be ascertained from other information. And of course, the larger problem stems from the fact that social media sites are not private spaces, nor were they ever intended to be. So, even though providers are mandated to keep our personal information private and secure, such as our account credentials or stored payment information, users should assume that anything they post publicly will not be kept private, and the providers are not required to do so either. We're knowingly posting information in a public space, so just about anyone who can view it has the ability to do just about anything with that information. Now, that said, in most cases, gathering data is not used for malicious purposes, The most common application is to customize ads so that we see those that are relevant to our interests, making us more likely to make a purchase. But if you were to post your credit card number to a social media site, which I realize is somewhat of an extreme example, you can be almost certain that someone will use it to start making unauthorized purchases. So the more personal and private your posts are with respect to information you want to keep private, the more likely it is that those posts will be used maliciously. Some examples of the data that can be gathered publicly on social media sites include personally identifiable information, or PII, perhaps not in the form of a driver's license or a passport, but attributes such as your age, gender, race, area of residence, and many others can be easily accessed. General attitudes and beliefs can be ascertained through your posts or status updates. Location information can be determined through check-ins and comments about where you were and or what you were doing. And work, schooling, and relationship status are also often available, any or all of which can be used to either identify you in the first place or build up a detailed digital profile of your life in general. Other attainable information might include purchasing history or browsing habits. Pictures are often posted of significant life events such as buying a new home or having children, and your reaction to the posts of others can also be used to flush out your online identity, such as liking or disliking a post of someone else regarding the results of an election or a new product they purchased. Toward that end, some useful tips with respect to using social media in a more private manner include changing your security settings to ensure they match your preferred level of privacy. For example, ensuring that only those on your friend list can see a post as opposed to anyone on the internet. Certain topics are obviously more private than others, so simply be mindful of exactly what it is you want to say and share, and know who you're connecting with. A very common approach these days is for malicious users to create fake profiles that use the profile pictures of existing friends to fool you into thinking that perhaps they mistakenly removed you from their friends list and now they're just re-adding you. So be sure to investigate the profile to be sure, or most effectively, see if that person still exists on your friend list. If they do, the new request is almost certainly fake. If offered by the provider, enable and use multi-factor authentication when you sign in, which requires at least 2 methods of establishing your identity. Make sure to use a strong password that is difficult to guess, and avoid signing into that service from public computers. Be mindful of clicking on any kind of link that you may have received in an email or even in the post of an existing friend. Some may have had their accounts already compromised and the post is trying to lure others. And consider disabling the service's ability to access your location services so that it can't be used to determine where you are. Again, many of us are all too willing to share this information, but as mentioned, other information can be ascertained from anything you do online, so always just bear that in mind when using social media sites. Email remains one of the most common forms of electronic communication. So in this presentation, we'll examine expectations regarding email privacy, which can be broken down into 2 main sections: privacy as the message is routed from the sender to its destination, and of course, privacy of the contents of the message itself. Now, with respect to both, privacy concerns will depend on the situation. For example, if you work within an organization and you send an email to another internal user in the same physical location, then that message never hits the public internet. And if the content of the message isn't overly confidential, then both areas of concern are minimal. But of course, that's only one example. In other cases, the exact opposite is true, whereby the contents are entirely confidential and the message does have to be routed over the public internet. So the concerns over privacy will vary based on the circumstances. So then, at which point can you consider email privacy to no longer be at risk? Well, unfortunately, there really is no time where privacy is not at risk, with the possible exception of when a message is entirely deleted. But let's look at an example where someone is sending a confidential message that must be routed over the internet. As the sender is composing the message, someone could be shoulder surfing as they type and could view the contents. And even if no one else is present, once sent, that message remains in the sent items folder on their system. So now it's just data at rest like any other information. And if their device is mobile and then it's lost or stolen, that message could be accessed. Every email that is sent must go through both the mail server of the sender and the mail server of the recipient, so unscrupulous messaging administrators could access messages as they pass through the servers. And in most corporate environments, client mailboxes, in fact, do not reside on the client devices. All mailboxes reside on the server, and the email client installed on the local device is simply an interface to the messages stored on that server. So all messages of all clients could again be accessed by an administrator without having to capture them, so to speak, right at the moment they're sent. Of course, as they traverse the internet, intruders might be eavesdropping to try to catch messages exiting your organization or entering the recipients. Or if the message was composed while connected to a public Wi-Fi, then it might have been intercepted as soon as it was sent. And even when it is finally received, just as it resides in the sent items folder of the sender, it will also reside in the inbox of the recipient. So once again, it's simply data at rest, which could again be accessed. And just coming back to deleting a message, even then, recall that it exists in two locations: the sender's sent items and the recipient's inbox. So in order for it to be entirely deleted, it would have to be removed from both locations. As for the two primary areas of concern of routing and message contents, unfortunately, the routing information, which includes the address of both the sender and the recipient, can't be obfuscated because the servers that are responsible for locating each other do so based on the registered domain names of each entity, which is the portion of the address after the @ symbol. In short, your server needs to be able to locate the server of the recipient to route the message appropriately, and the recipient server needs to be able to verify the domain name of the sender in case there are any filters in place that prevent message receipt from that domain. But the message contents can be protected provided the appropriate security protocols are in place, such as SSL or TLS, which are Secure Sockets Layer and Transport Layer Security, respectively. Other aspects of email privacy can include monitoring practices by the entity hosting the email on the network, which in fact is often in place within organizational networks. While the network as a whole might be regarded as private in that information within the network remains protected, activities that occur on that network may be often internally monitored by administrative or security personnel, which helps to reduce the likelihood of internal security breaches. But in those cases, users would have to be made aware of the monitoring practices, and they would have to agree to them. Similarly, the use of public Wi-Fi networks is inherently not secure, of course, because they're public, but they can also be monitored. And while it's likely that very few of us have ever actually read any terms of use agreements, whenever we click on I agree or I accept after connecting to a public Wi-Fi, such as in an airport or a hotel, it's likely stated in the terms of use policy that monitoring might be conducted. So once we agree to those terms, email privacy can no longer be expected. So then, when it comes to working with email privacy, for starters, it's important to recognize and understand the difference between security and privacy. These terms may often be used somewhat interchangeably, at least in day-to-day conversation, but security refers to how data is protected against unauthorized access, whereas privacy refers to how data is gathered, shared, and/or disseminated. For example, a provider might use encryption to protect the security of the messages they store, but they might make your address information available to other entities for personalizing ads. So it's important to select a reliable and reputable provider to handle your messaging needs. And you can also help yourself by simply being mindful of what you include in an email For instance, do not include any personally identifiable information such as account numbers or passwords in an email. Be equally mindful of what you click on in messages that you receive. For example, any message that asks you to click the link provided to verify your account credentials is almost certainly an attempt to fool you into revealing that information. And similarly, any attachments that you might receive should never be opened unless you know and trust the sender, or it is at least something that you are expecting. Attachments that claim to be regarding account information from a service you don't use, or anything that asks you to install something, are almost always questionable, to say the least. In short, if there is any doubt, either delete the message or at least seek the advice of someone more familiar with email security before taking any action. For all of its benefits, unfortunately, email remains a very common point of attack, so be sure to implement as many of these and other best practices to ensure that your email activities remain as private and as secure as possible. One of the key benefits of digital information is that it can be shared with any number of users using a variety of methods. But of course, that introduces several concerns. So in this video, we'll examine some expectations and considerations with respect to privacy and security when it comes to sharing files, which can include the possibility of compromised account credentials, whereby a malicious user could pose as a legitimate user to disseminate harmful or malicious files, hacking or phishing attempts to try to gain access to confidential information, and even threats from malicious or disgruntled internal users who might be trying to access secure data or launch a denial of service attack to disrupt the organization's ability to function. Now, there are a number of ways by which files can be shared, including standard LAN and/or WAN connections of the organizational network, in which case nothing more than shared folders on servers are required. For example, if I create a document and I need someone else to have access to that document, I don't necessarily have to email it to them as an attachment. I can simply place the file into a folder on a server to which we both have access, and each entity will be able to access it at any time. Cloud storage can also be used, whereby I can create a folder with my provider and send an invitation to the other person, which will similarly give them access to that folder, which can be much more useful for sharing content with those outside of your network, or even if it's just personal content that you want to share with a family member or a friend. The file transfer protocol is designed specifically to move data from one place to another, although this is less common these days with the prevalence of cloud storage because both entities would need access to the same FTP server, but it is certainly still an option. And of course, standard removable media such as flash drives are still very commonly used. But of course, as soon as you do want to share information with any other entity, some concerns of course include the security and privacy of the data being shared, in that you want to ensure that only the appropriate entities have the appropriate level of access to that content. For example, I might want you to see the content that I've created, but not anyone else. I also might want to ensure that you can view it, but that you can't make any changes to it. And once you do give access to another entity, there can also be concerns over malware. If by chance the other user's device has been infected, then that malware could spread to the file they've just accessed. In addition, most major operating systems have built-in sharing features so that if you are on the same network as someone else with whom you want to share files, you can simply create a shared folder on your own computer and grant access to the other user. But some operating systems and network configurations allow you to do so without any kind of security, such as password protection. And if it's just a small office network, then it might only be configured as a work group, in which case you might have to share the file with effectively open permissions, meaning that anyone could access the file if they discover it. Another concern is the use of internet-based peer-to-peer sharing services, many of which are often used to obtain illegal and/or pirated downloads, and anything accessed from such a service from a corporate location could put the entire organization at risk, not just from potential malware, but legally as well. So in terms of protecting files that are being shared, it begins with simply knowing exactly what you are sharing. In other words, be certain that the information you're sharing is not sensitive or confidential. Or, if it is, be sure that you configure the appropriate file permissions so that only the intended recipient can access the data and at an appropriate level, which again refers to their ability to perhaps just view the content as opposed to making changes. For the most sensitive data, you should also implement encryption both when the data is at rest and in transit to ensure that if it is intercepted, it can't be accessed. Now, with respect to encryption at rest, you may be able to implement that yourself simply through the file system of the local device or through specific operating system features. For example, Windows-based computers offer NTFS encryption inherently through the file system, which can encrypt individual files or folders, or you can enable BitLocker, which encrypts the entire hard drive, which protects it against being accessed even if the device is lost or stolen, and someone attempts to gain access to the data by removing the hard drive and installing it into a different computer. But both of those options only protect the data at rest. As soon as you move the file off of the drive, such as by placing it into an email as an attachment, the encryption is removed. So for data in transit, if you're in a corporate networking environment, you should verify that services such as email do include encryption. And if using cloud storage or any other type of internet-based service, be sure that secured HTTP or HTTPS is being used as opposed to just HTTP, which is not secured. In addition, you should always have an up-to-date antivirus and/or anti-malware application installed, as well as a firewall to protect content from infection and intrusion. Corporate environments can implement data classification mechanisms that can use rules to identify sensitive information, such as personally identifiable information, and classify it so that certain actions are prevented. For example, employee information such as social security numbers, dates of birth, address information, or anything else that can identify a person can be classified as confidential, which can then be associated with security policies that can prevent that information from being attached in an email, copied, printed, or saved to a removable drive. User knowledge of what the risks are can be one of the most effective tools in preventing the spread of sensitive information, particularly if it pertains directly to them. And of course, always be mindful of which applications are being used to share information and the level of security they provide, such as the ability to encrypt information. The ability to share information is, of course, very necessary in the world of information technology, but of course it also introduces the possibility of that information falling into the wrong hands. So try to remain mindful of these and other best practices to ensure that any data you do share is done so in a secure manner. In this presentation, we'll provide an overview of some privacy concerns with respect to the use of instant messaging, including text messaging, also known as SMS, which stands for Short Messaging Service, and any kind of real-time chat application or service, both of which provide for quick and easy communication, of course, but like anything, whenever information is being exchanged, there are concerns over its privacy. For example, anything that you send to anyone else may be retained by the service provider, and even if it isn't, copies of whatever is sent remains on both devices by default. So for something like text messages on mobile phones in particular, if either device is lost or stolen and someone is able to get into the interface, they could access everything that is saved on that device. Some common concerns regarding instant messaging can include spam messages or phishing attempts, which are just as prevalent in instant messaging apps and services as they are in email. For example, spammers will send out phishing attempts to every possible phone number in a region, perhaps claiming to offer a refund on tax returns or informing you of a failed or delayed delivery attempt of a package that requires an extra fee to process. And in social media-based IM apps, anyone could send you a message posing as someone else on your friends list with the correct profile picture and account name and everything else because they simply created a profile using that person's picture and name. So you may not be communicating with the legitimate person at all. Now, depending on the application or service, you might need to accept the sender first, but again, they may be very effectively posing as someone you do know. So be sure to verify the entity first, particularly in the case of account impersonation. One of the most effective ways is to simply see if that person is still in your friend list, and if they are, then this new request is almost certainly not legitimate. You can also block requests that you know aren't legitimate, although in the case of spam messages, the spammers are constantly changing the source from which their messages originate, so it can be an ongoing battle. But you can also report the sender in most cases, which can also be an ongoing battle because they do change their source regularly, but it at least forces them to keep doing so, making it more difficult for them to continue to send their fraudulent messages in the first place. When selecting an instant messaging platform or service, you can also choose more secure services that offer features such as encrypted communications, self-destructing messages that will automatically delete themselves after being read or after a certain time frame, and warnings and blockers that can alert you to potentially dangerous content or a questionable link in the message, or that the message originated from an unknown sender so that you can take the appropriate action before even opening it. Additional security measures include securing your device itself by ensuring a PIN or some kind of passcode is required to access the interface, and enabling security features such as the ability to remotely lock the device or even erase it entirely if it's lost or stolen. Be sure to keep your phone number private. In particular, avoid posting it on social media sites, and whenever possible, enable and use multi-factor authentication features, which require at least 2 methods of establishing your identity, which makes it more difficult for an intruder to gain access to your account. For example, if they do ascertain your username and password, with multi-factor authentication enabled, a sign-in attempt might also require a code that is sent to your mobile phone via a text message or perhaps to an email address. So unless that person also has your phone and/or that address, they would not receive the code. Lastly, when using instant messaging applications, avoid using public Wi-Fi networks, particularly those without a password configured. Never open any links in a message unless you're certain they're legitimate. And for desktops and laptops, be sure that your antivirus and/or anti-malware application is running and up to date. And if you're using a phone or a tablet, there may not be an anti-malware application, but they are available, so consider installing one if you do rely on instant messaging applications quite heavily. Like anything in the world of information privacy and security, nothing is 100% effective, but by familiarizing yourself with the most common threats, you can implement the appropriate measures to at least make your instant messaging applications as secure as possible. In this video, we'll provide an overview of privacy expectations when it comes to software for all types of devices, including desktops, laptops, smartphones, and tablets, which begins with ensuring that whatever applications you're installing or intend to install are from trusted sources. Then you should always ensure that you understand what information an app might want from you. For example, some apps may be associated with a service for which you need to create an account. And you should always be mindful of what kind of permissions or access it might require to other features of your device. For example, a video conferencing application will legitimately need access to your camera and likely your contacts, but something like a game should likely not have access to those features. As for the trusted sources, these days perhaps the best option is to use the App Store of the platform, such as the Microsoft Store, the Apple App Store, and the Google Play Store. And the reason is because these stores only offer apps that have been vetted and tested by the vendor, so they're known to be trustworthy. It's of course no benefit to the vendor to allow just any app into their store, because it could compromise the security of their devices, and they could be held responsible for the consequences if something were to become compromised. So anything obtained through the app stores can be trusted. But that said, even though the apps available in the stores have been vetted, there are still free apps that are available which, although free in terms of monetary costs, may have other costs associated with them. For example, in exchange for their no-cost use, they may require access to the device itself or its features, which could still represent a possible compromise to your privacy expectations. Now, the app may only do so to gain access to data that might serve the vendor in a marketing manner, so it's not that it's malicious in nature, but it still might be gathering data that you don't want to reveal. One of the most common examples is an app that, for no obvious reason, needs access to your location services, which can then help it to determine your daily habits, which can in turn be used to personalize ads so they're more effective. So again, this isn't really a malicious feature, but it does possibly constitute an invasion of privacy. Now, that said, in most cases, when you launch the app, it will prompt you for access to the features it needs or wants, so you certainly can disallow them, but that may also disable its ability to be used in an effective manner. So it's just something to be mindful of when installing free apps. They usually aren't entirely free, so to speak. Now, I would guess that it's likely that most of us are familiar with obtaining apps from an app store when using our mobile devices, such as phones and tablets, but apps can also be obtained for desktops and laptops from the same stores. But in most cases, desktop apps are available from many other sources as well. For example, there are many centralized download sources available on the internet from which many different apps can be obtained. And since they aren't really regulated by any particular entity, the risk posed by downloading apps from such sites simply increases, particularly when downloading third-party and/or free apps because they simply aren't vetted by anyone. Now, using these types of sites certainly doesn't mean that you're always going to get something malicious, but there is an increased risk of that happening. So it's still just as recommended to use the app stores for desktops and laptops as it is for phones and tablets. So when it comes to protecting yourself from potential software privacy issues, you should always be aware of the device settings with respect to the apps that are installed. For instance, if you do go to something like the location services option of your device, it will list every application and whether that application has access to that feature. And the same applies to many other features such as your camera, microphone, contacts, and calendar. So be sure to regularly check which apps have access to which features. And also be mindful of what the app might ask you when it's launched for the first time. We tend to see these prompts so often that we just click on allow or agree without really verifying what we're agreeing to. Again, use only trusted sources such as the app stores, but I do want to mention that they certainly aren't the only option. The site of the application vendor itself is usually trustworthy. For example, something like the Adobe Acrobat Reader, which is very commonly used, can certainly be downloaded safely directly from Adobe's website, but some mobile device platforms only allow downloads from their respective stores. And while downloading from any source might be available on some platforms, there may be a configurable option in the settings to prevent that. For example, on a Windows 10 or 11 device, there is an option in the Apps section of the settings that can be set to Microsoft Store only when it comes to download sources. And if you're in a corporate environment, that may have been set by administration through a security policy, which means that you wouldn't be able to change it. And of course, you should also ensure that your device is set to use a passcode known only to you so that someone else is not able to gain access to the interface and install something malicious without your knowledge. On a related note, your device should also be locked whenever you're away from it, which then requires the passcode or password to get back into the interface, again preventing unknown installs or downloads while you're away. You can also configure sites that are either explicitly allowed or blocked by the browser, which ensures that you can't even arrive at sites that are blocked, and always ensure that encryption or secured HTTP is in use for anything that is being downloaded. Or perhaps more to the point, if a download site is not using encryption, then it should almost certainly be considered to be a questionable source. Like anything related to security and privacy, user knowledge is often one of the best tools when it comes to software privacy. So if there is any doubt as to the legitimacy of an application and/or what it's used for, a little extra research can go a long way in terms of mitigating your software privacy concerns. In this video, we'll take a look at privacy concerns in networked environments, which in this context refers to the organizational networks of corporate environments, not so much for home networks or small offices. And the primary reason why this is a concern is because in many cases, those types of networks are regularly and extensively monitored, which in many cases may be required by law because threats to such organizations don't just come from the outside. Internal threats are every bit as real, so monitoring may be required to ensure that security is maintained from both perspectives. As such, this can lead to a situation whereby personal privacy within that network simply can't be afforded. Now, it's not as though you wouldn't be made aware of this if you were an employee. In fact, it would almost certainly be included in your employment agreement, job description, or contract, so you would have to agree to their terms to be eligible to work there in the first place. But in that case, you need to be aware that personal privacy may not be available at all as long as you're operating within that environment. Now, the primary reasons why monitoring might be required include preventing theft of secure information or assets, or to regulate access and activities in sensitive areas such as server rooms, or to gather evidence for potential investigations or litigation should it become necessary. And even if an organization is legally bound to carry out monitoring activities, the degree to which it's done can still vary, and in some cases it might only be an organizational policy, not a legal requirement. So be sure to familiarize yourself with those policies and the degree to which monitoring is performed. But a good general approach in any environment is to assume that everything is monitored, thereby allowing you to avoid any privacy or legal issues to begin with, provided, of course, you don't do anything that would go against any policies that might be in place. Now, in keeping with remaining in compliance with any monitoring policies that are in effect, it's helpful to know some of the common methods that are used for monitoring purposes, which can include various types of monitoring software, which can vary in purpose, but ultimately they all perform the same task of gathering information. For example, employee monitoring software can inform managers how their employees are spending their time while at work. And network monitoring software can literally capture packets that are traversing the network to identify suspicious or malicious content. Each serves a very specific purpose, but both provide insight into what is happening within the organization. Biometric data can be used to track physical location. For example, if administrators need to provide a fingerprint to access the server room, that access is recorded, so it is always known who entered the room and when. They might also be required to provide it again when they leave, so that the duration of their activities is recorded. Similarly, location services on GPS or mobile devices can be used to track employee movements, such as in delivery vehicles, to ensure that they don't deviate from their prescribed routes or that they aren't used for personal purposes. Other common monitoring methods might include surveilling user devices, including email and online activity originating from that device, recording telephone communications, capturing voicemail or instant messages, and using video cameras. Automated rules for detecting large data transfers to portable devices, which could indicate an attempt to steal intellectual property or other corporately owned data, and detection of confidential information sharing, which is typically implemented through data classification rules, whereby any given classification dictates which entities would have which level of access, and any access outside of those rules would trigger an alert or a notification. Again, when it comes to privacy in a corporate networking environment, the privacy in question is that of the organization itself, not the individual. So if you want to work for such an organization, you should assume that personal privacy is not really maintained at all, and ideally concern yourself as much with protecting the organization's privacy as you would for your own. In this presentation, we'll take a look at the implementation and use of security and privacy policies, which are typically a set of documented rules and procedures that must be observed within an organization so that all information, both physical and electronic, and all physical assets are protected. They might also specify any kind of secure locations within the organization where access is restricted and or controlled to ensure that unauthorized personnel don't attempt to gain access. But whatever is contained in a security policy of any kind is usually meant to ensure that everything within the domain of the organization is properly secured with respect to the activities of the internal users. In terms of the policy itself, it should include identification of who is responsible for the policy in terms of establishing the rules to begin with and keeping them up to date, and it should also provide rationale as to why any given aspect of the policy is in place, which helps all parties involved to understand the nature of the policy. It should also clearly establish goals with respect to how it aligns with the direction of the organization, and of course, it should define exactly what and or to whom it applies. For example, an organization's HR department would likely have access to more confidential information than their shipping department, so certain aspects may not apply across the entire organization. And for those who operate under the policy on a daily basis, it should define usage, such as which devices, locations, or assets are available to be used, areas of authorized versus unauthorized access, including data and other electronic resources such as intranet sites or information libraries, and it should include storage and handling procedures for secure information such as data taken from a customer when they place an order or when private or confidential account information is taken from a client. By observing the rules of the policy, it will help the organization to ensure that they remain in compliance with any regulations that might oversee their operations, and it also helps to reduce the risk of general security issues such as breaches, data loss, or malicious attack. Another common element of a security and privacy policy is the acceptable use policy, which, in short, defines what is acceptable or permitted and what is not when it comes to a particular resource. And many organizations may require you to sign one as a condition of your employment or to at least be allowed access to that resource, but that will depend on the nature of the organization. However, they tend to be implemented separately from the overall security policy because they can apply differently to different resources. For example, if your organization issues you a mobile device that is owned by the organization, they may require you to sign an acceptable use policy which defines what you can and can't do with that device. For instance, it would be quite likely that you would not be allowed to jailbreak the device to install applications that are not approved by the organization, and doing so would violate the terms of the policy, which could then qualify as grounds for your dismissal. But a different resource, such as a company vehicle, would have different conditions for its use, such as a limit on its mileage per month. So there may be various and or numerous acceptable use policies that might apply to your position. The AUP may also define the ramifications of abusing that resource, such as the aforementioned grounds for dismissal, but they might not always be that severe, of course. And they may also identify the actions that should be taken in the event of a security breach. For example, if you are issued a mobile device, through no fault of your own, the device may have been stolen. So the AUP might indicate what should be done in that case, such as notifying a manager or a technical support department as soon as its loss is realized. Acceptable use policies typically apply to the use of organizational equipment such as company vehicles or mobile devices, or other types of resources such as expense accounts. They may also define if and or when personally owned devices can be used in the corporate environment, and the use of various software and or services such as the internal email service. But in all cases, as the name implies, the policy should clearly state what is acceptable and ideally what is not acceptable. Other varieties of security policies may include remote work procedures, which might specify conditions such as not using public or unsecured Wi-Fi networks, compliance policies, which might specify that devices must apply the latest security updates to remain in compliance, and malware and virus policies, which might similarly specify that all devices must have an antivirus or anti-malware application installed, and that they must also apply all updates regularly, and they might also specify which action should be taken if malware is detected. Ultimately, the security policies you might encounter will vary depending on the nature of the organization, but they virtually all share the same goal of defining ways by which the security and privacy of an organization, its employees, customers, students, or anyone else who might be connected to that organization can be protected as best as possible. In this video, we'll outline several considerations with respect to handling and protecting private and confidential information, which can apply to both those who are internal and external to any given organization. For instance, an organization must gather certain personal information from the employees they hire, as well as from their customers. But all of that information must be handled correctly. So, beginning with one of the most commonly used pieces of information, passwords are certainly information that must be handled correctly, and in many cases this might apply to both internal staff and external customers. For example, a bank must store the passwords of its own employees, but we as customers also create passwords to access online banking services, so they must both be handled correctly, although there might be different requirements for each depending on the organization, of course. But common measures that are implemented to handle passwords correctly include the use of password policies, which define rules as to how passwords must be used, such as the minimum number of characters required, how complex they are, which refers to the use of both upper and lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, an expiry date, which requires users to change their password to something else after a certain amount of time, and password history, which refers to whether old passwords can be recycled or reused. So by defining these policies, an organization can help to ensure that passwords are used as securely as possible, because most policies will require that the password be fairly lengthy, that they use complexity, and that they're required to be changed, and that old passwords can't be reused, at least not until a certain number of new passwords have been used. This helps to improve security because if a very short, simple password was used for a very long time, then it's much easier for an attacker to guess it or otherwise figure out what it is. Organizations will undoubtedly also store personal information, again, for both internal and external users. And of course, there can be many things that would fall under the category of personal information, but it primarily falls under the category of what is known as personally identifiable information, or PII, which covers just about anything that could be used to establish your identity. So with respect to how an organization should handle personal information, it generally begins with applying the principle of least privilege, which in short defines that only the minimum level of access be granted to only the necessary entities. Or to put that another way, everyone in the organization should not have full access to personal data. Personal data also needs to be stored securely, which refers to implementing features such as disk encryption so that it cannot be accessed by any unauthorized entity, and that it also be backed up to protect it against physical loss, and of course access to the backups must also be controlled. In addition, proper handling of personal information should also dictate that it be destroyed when it is no longer needed. For example, if you close an account with an organization, they should not retain any of your personal information. Common examples of confidential information that might be gathered by an organization might include customer information, both for existing customers and previous customers. Now, bear in mind that I just mentioned how personal data should generally be destroyed if it's no longer needed, such as when a customer closes their account. But it can depend on the nature of the organization, and of course exactly which data is gathered to begin with. So, if for example you do close some kind of an account with an organization, it would be likely that they would be required to destroy information such as payment methods, but they still might retain your contact information because they would likely attempt to bring you back as a customer in the future. You might have received periodic "we want you back" emails, as an example. Of course, accounting and payment information regarding their customers and employee information such as their bank accounts used for payroll and other confidential information must be stored, and trade secrets or intellectual property might also be stored by an organization, all of which must be dealt with properly in terms of both storage and access. And handling that information properly also means ensuring the security of the devices that are used to access it. For example, if a person does have authorization to access confidential information from a mobile device, but then that device is lost or stolen, and the device itself is not properly secured with a passcode, then anyone could gain access to the data through that device. And I touched on backups earlier, but they can't just be one-off backups. Data needs to be backed up regularly to account for changes to the original information, and there should also be multiple copies that are stored in separate locations to ensure that no single event causes a complete loss of data. For instance, one copy could be maintained on site, and another could be maintained in the cloud. Users also need to be made aware of potentially dangerous activities such as downloading unknown software or clicking on unknown links, which could of course lead to malware infection, which in turn could provide access to sensitive information. Lastly, all updates and patches need to be applied regularly to ensure that recently discovered vulnerabilities in applications or operating systems are discovered. And ultimately, perhaps one of the most effective tools with respect to handling sensitive information is user training. As long as users are fully aware of the policies and procedures that are in place, then you can greatly reduce the likelihood of that information being accessed in an unauthorized manner. Again, the nature of the policies and procedures you encounter will vary depending on the organization, but almost every organization must handle sensitive information to some degree, so it's likely that you'll encounter some form of security policy at one point or another. In this video, we'll examine some best practices for enforcing a password policy within an organization, which define rules that must be observed when users create their passwords. They exist primarily to ensure that users don't use very simple passwords that are easily guessed or easily determined through a variety of attack methods known as dictionary or brute force attacks, whereby programs are used to attempt to guess at the password until the correct one is found. But the basic premise is that shorter passwords are easier to determine, or to put that another way, longer passwords that are more complex are much harder to determine. And one of the best ways to increase the strength of your password is to simply require more characters. So almost every password policy will place a minimum on the number of characters that can be used, with 8 being the standard recommended minimum, although it really can be any length depending on the organization. But with every extra character required, the number of possibilities as to what the password could be increases significantly. As a very simple example, let's just imagine that a password could only contain a single digit 0 through 9. Well, in that case, you have a 1 in 10 chance of guessing it. But if you require 2 digits, well, now there are 10 options for the first character and 10 options for the second, or 10 times 10. So now the chance of guessing it is 1 in 100. Add a third digit, now it's 1 in 1,000. And in that example, we're only using the digits of 0 through 9, which of course would never be done in a real-world scenario. So by including letters in both cases, because almost all passwords are case-sensitive, numbers, and symbols such as punctuation characters and the symbols found above the numbers at the top of your keyboard, and requiring, let's say, 10 characters in total, the number of possibilities becomes enormous, and the result is a much more complex password that is almost impossible to guess. The password expiry is exactly as it sounds, and it forces the user to change their password after a set period of time. Now, users will typically receive advance notice so that they're prepared, so to speak, when the expiry is reached, but the time frame is entirely up to the organization. Higher security environments tend to have shorter durations, again with the thinking that the longer you have the same password, the more time you give an attacker to determine what it is. But you do need to be somewhat careful with the duration, because forcing changes too often will likely lead to a certain degree of predictability in the passwords. Even if they are complex, users might still use mostly the same password each time, but then just increment something like the last character by 1. So if, for example, the original password was bananas, the new password will simply be bananas1, then bananas2, and so on. And often used in conjunction with the password expiry is the password history, which means that when you are required to change it, you aren't able to change it back to something that you were just using. Now, it might not be the case that you can't ever use the same password again, but most environments will specify a minimum number of passwords that must be used before you can use a previous one again. For instance, in a Microsoft Active Directory network, the default value for the history is 24. So you can't use an old password again until you've used at least 24 new ones. And the logic behind this is similar to the duration, in that if a user is allowed to reuse the same password over and over again, you give an attacker much more opportunity to determine what it is. But if you have to keep changing it to something new, then it becomes less likely that anyone will be able to guess it, particularly if it adheres to all other complexity requirements. Now, while almost every organization will implement some kind of password policy, they can create some issues. Even though you might not be able to reuse a password within one environment, there is nothing stopping you from reusing that same password in another organization, which means that if someone does discover your password, they could gain access to any number of services or websites. I'd say it's likely that almost all of us that use passwords are or have been guilty of this at one point or another, myself included. And it simply comes down to the fact that remembering so many passwords is difficult, especially if they all have to be very complex. So this can lead to users writing them down in not particularly secure locations. I can in fact recall several instances in my own career where I've seen a list of passwords written on a sticky note that is either in plain view or just stored in an unlocked drawer. But these days we do at least have password managers, which can store passwords for us so that we don't have to remember them. Most modern browsers have password managers built in, or there are also third-party apps that can be used. Other aspects of password policies that you're likely to encounter include services that support what's known as single sign-on or SSO. This means that signing into one service automatically signs you into another related service so that you don't have to sign in twice. A common example of this is an internal organization that also uses cloud services. For instance, in a Microsoft Active Directory environment, when users sign into their computers in the local environment, they can then also access resources in Microsoft Azure, which is their primary cloud platform, without having to sign in separately. In short, the Azure environment trusts the sign-in of the local environment. And to prevent someone from trying over and over again to guess your password, an account lockout setting defines how many unsuccessful attempts will be accepted before the account locks itself out entirely. Once it is locked, no one, including the legitimate user, can attempt to use that account. So if you discover that your account is already locked out without having even tried to sign in, then almost certainly someone else was trying to use your account. A lockout setting is perhaps the most effective way to defeat hacking attempts such as dictionary or brute force attacks, which rely on the ability to try over and over again. To unlock the account, you typically have to contact administration to verify your identity and have the password reset. And on that note, of course, there are instances when users do legitimately forget their password, which is usually a side effect of having to remember so many. So users are generally able to reset passwords on their own, usually by clicking on a link that says, "I forgot my password." Or in a corporate environment, they might be able to do it right from their own local computers. But of course, if you have forgotten the password, then you need to be able to provide some other means of establishing your identity, which might involve the use of security questions, or you may just receive an email that provides a link to click on, which brings you to a reset page, because of course the service assumes that only you would have access to that email. Now, just to finish up, It's worth mentioning that, especially these days where social media is so prevalent, the answers to security questions can often be ascertained by social engineering techniques, such as creating a post that asks users to list their favorite restaurant, or places where they met their partner, favorite travel destinations, or the names of their pets. These types of posts are almost certainly phishing for the answers to security questions by those who comment. So be as mindful of revealing those answers as you would for the password itself. In this presentation, we'll introduce the basics of data encryption, how it works, and why it's needed in today's world of information technology. But to begin, we'll start with what's known as plain text, which quite simply is any text that is readable by humans, and perhaps more to the point, it does not have any encryption applied. As such, nothing is required to reveal the information other than having access to it. Now, clearly there are many situations where plain text is required, and the applications we use daily, such as simple text editors, word processing applications, email clients, and browsers to view HTML pages, are all meant to present us with plain text information to ensure that we can access the information whenever it's appropriate. For example, if I need to send out a simple email to arrange a lunch meeting with you tomorrow, I'm likely not all that concerned about encrypting that information. So clearly the use of plain text has its place in information technology. But there are, of course, many situations where sensitive or confidential data must be exchanged between entities, in which case we want to ensure that only the authorized entities are able to access that information. So ciphertext refers to information that is encrypted, which scrambles the data, so to speak, so that it is in fact unreadable to any unauthorized entities who might intercept it. Now, encryption is implemented by using complex mathematical algorithms to replace the existing characters with other characters, in varying degrees of strength depending on the algorithm used. But any data that has been encrypted must, of course, be decrypted before it can be used, and this process requires the use of what are known as encryption keys. Now, this is a very simple example, but if I want to secretly pass information to you, I begin with the plain text data. Then I devise an encryption key, which might be to replace each letter with the letter that follows it in the alphabet. So in English, the word apple becomes BQQMF, which is not a particularly readable word. But in order for me to pass that encrypted value on to you and ensure that you can understand the original plain text value, I need to ensure that you also know the encryption key that was used. As long as you do, you can take the encrypted value and run it through that same process, essentially in reverse, and arrive at the plain text value. Now again, I stress that this is a painfully simple example which would be easily cracked. So modern encryption algorithms are tremendously complex, so much so that the word apple might appear to have hundreds of characters, and that the number of possible substitution characters for any actual character could be almost limitless. Now, the math itself is far too complex to cover in a short presentation, and honestly, I'm no mathematician. But a very common example that many of us use regularly is when we make purchases online by providing credit card information. Obviously, we want to ensure that the information we submit is readable by the online retailer, but perhaps more to the point, we want to ensure that if an intruder does intercept the packets while in transit, that they aren't able to access the information. Now, there's a bit more to the process than this, but at a basic level, when we access these sites, the trusted entity, the online retailer, downloads what's known as a public key to our computers, which we can then use to encrypt the information that we supply. The public key is included in the digital certificate of the website, and anyone can obtain a public key. But the way the algorithm works is that the trusted entity maintains what's known as a private key, which, as its name indicates, is held only by that entity. And any information that is encrypted with a public key can only be decrypted with the private key. So even if an intruder does intercept your packets, and even if they also have a public key, which again anyone can obtain, the public key cannot be used to decrypt information that was encrypted with another public key. Only the private key can do that. So the online retailer is the only entity that will be able to read the credit card information that you've submitted, and they can process your order accordingly. Now, to finish up, of course, that's only one example of how encryption can be implemented. There are other processes, other algorithms, and other applications. But one of the best aspects of modern encryption techniques is that they're almost entirely transparent to us. We don't have to do anything to make use of secured transactions online, other than to simply verify that the site is trusted and to ensure that it does have a digital certificate. Other encryption techniques might require us to enable it. For example, on a Windows computer, you can encrypt the entire contents of your hard drive by enabling a feature known as BitLocker. But once enabled, there is nothing that you, as the legitimate user, have to do to access your data. In other words, you don't have to run it through some kind of decryption algorithm. You simply open files normally. But anyone who might steal your laptop, let's say, and attempt to gain access to the data by removing the hard drive and attaching it to their own computer would not be able to gain access to that data because they did not sign in using the identity you were using when you enabled the encryption in the first place. So much like having a public key is of no use to access information that was encrypted with another public key, your identity can act as part of the encryption algorithm, and without it, the data remains inaccessible. So be sure to make use of or take advantage of encryption whenever it's necessary to protect your data or to secure your online transactions. For our final video of this course, we'll examine data in transit and methods by which it can be protected using encryption. Now, for starters, data in transit is exactly that. It's data that is being transferred from one system to another. But in this context, it usually refers to that transfer taking place over a network or over the internet. Data could be considered to be in transit if, for example, I copy a file to a flash drive, then bring that flash drive to you. But in that case, the data is at rest on the flash drive, and I'm the one in motion. So from the perspective of network security, data in transit refers to using a network connection of some description. Now, protecting data in transit can be more challenging than protecting data at rest because it's inherently less secure. Discounting things like backups or replicated copies for a moment, we always know where data at rest is, and it's usually in a much more controlled environment. For instance, a document on a network server might simply be on the hard drive of that server, and the server itself might reside in a secure server room where only network administrators have access. But data in transit has more potential attack points. For example, if I'm in a corporate network and I send an email to someone outside of that network, it has to traverse the network from my computer to my mail server. Then it will go from my mail server to the router or access point to the internet. Then it will go to the router at the organization where the recipient resides, then to that mail server, then to the recipient device. Any one of those points represents an avenue of attack, especially while on the public internet. But fortunately, encryption can also be used for data in transit, and should be used for any communication that should remain confidential or private. Now, there are many different ways by which data can be transferred, so there are also various methods by which encryption for data in transit can be implemented. In keeping with the example just mentioned, email remains one of the most common methods of transferring data. So to secure email messages in transit, there are a few different protocols and methods, including PGP, which literally stands for Pretty Good Privacy, which is an open source service for encrypting email communications and can be implemented in just about any organization for free. And as its name indicates, it provides a pretty good level of security. But because it's open source, it's not standardized. Secure Multipurpose Internet Mail Extensions, or SMIME, is built into most email platforms these days, so the functionality itself doesn't cost anything, But it also requires that an organization obtain certificates from a public certification authority, which does incur a cost, although it's not all that much to obtain a certificate these days. But since certificates are used, SMIME is a standard of the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF. Transport Layer Security, or TLS, is the successor to SSL, or Secure Sockets Layer, and it's also an IETF standard, but it uses more advanced security protocols than SMIME and can also incorporate other services such as instant messaging and voice over IP. HTTPS is the secure implementation of the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which most of us know as simply the protocol of the Internet. Basic unsecured sites can be accessed using just HTTP, but as soon as security is required, such as when we make purchases online, HTTPS must be used. Otherwise, the information you submit, such as your username and password, and of course your payment information, could be accessible to anyone who might be listening. The S simply stands for secure, but in its original implementation, it used Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, to provide the encryption. So some may have thought that the S was short for SSL, but again, it only means that the protocol is secured. And in fact, the newer implementation of HTTPS uses Transport Layer Security to provide encryption because it's a more robust protocol than SSL. HTTPS also uses publicly issued certificates along with public and private keys to secure information exchanges, which is also referred to as PKI, or Public Key Infrastructure, whereby data that is sent from one location can be protected by using a public encryption key. Then the recipient uses a private key that is held only by them to decrypt the information. And anything that is encrypted with a public key can only be decrypted with the private key. And again, only the intended recipient has access to their private key. Virtual private networks, or VPNs, provide a service known as tunneling, whereby a persistent and secure connection can be established between two endpoints, up to and including any system that can be reached over the public internet. Hence the term virtual private network, because VPNs allow us to use the most public network there is in a private manner. VPNs work by establishing a connection between the client and the VPN endpoint, which virtually extends the network of the provider around the client device, so to speak. And from a networking perspective, once connected, that client might as well be inside the provider's network, and it can operate as if it was in the network of the provider, which of course can have much greater security in place as compared to using something like a public Wi-Fi in a restaurant, airport, or hotel. For example, if your workplace provides VPN connectivity, then you can work from home or while traveling simply by connecting to the VPN, which is usually just a matter of double-clicking an icon on your desktop that has been set up by administration, which then asks you for a little more than your username and password. As soon as you log in successfully, you can print to the printers in the office, you can access your email on the internal mail servers, connect to the intranet sites, and access shared folders on the servers, just as if you were physically there. And any activity you then perform on the internet goes through the tunnel as well, and then through your corporate environment first, so you gain the benefits of the firewalls in your network and any other security services. From the perspective of the rest of the world, all traffic is originating from your corporate network as opposed to the network where you actually are. On top of all that, all data that passes through the tunnel itself is encrypted so that even if someone does intercept packets, the contents of those packets still can't be accessed. If you don't have VPN services through your work, there are many cloud providers that offer VPNs on a subscription basis. So, for example, if you're a contractor or a consultant that works with many organizations and you need more secure data transfers with any or all of them, you can simply subscribe to a VPN provider of your choice, then connect to that before you initiate any transfers with your clients. Lastly, encryption for data in transit from mobile devices can certainly be implemented, but they aren't necessarily secured by default. Common platforms such as iOS and Android do implement local device encryption as soon as a passcode is enabled, but for applications such as secure email or messaging, you may have to enable a specific feature, or install a separate app or service depending on which type of service you're using. If you aren't sure, consult the documentation for the app or service in question, or do some general research to determine if encryption is supported for that app or service. Ultimately, data in transit can present some additional challenges with respect to maintaining security, but there are services and features available to help ensure that you can move data securely in just about any situation. In this presentation, we'll provide an overview of data at rest and how it can be protected by using encryption. Now, to begin, data at rest is pretty much exactly as it sounds. It refers to the fact that data is not currently being used, nor is it being transferred between any endpoints. It's simply stored on a device such as a hard drive. But without any form of encryption, data at rest can be vulnerable, even if permissions have been defined. For example, if there's a file on your local hard drive right now, and you've specified that you are the only entity that has permission to that file, then if another user were to log on to that computer with a different user account and attempt to open that file, they would be denied. However, if that other person's account is an administrative account, then they have the ability to take ownership of any files that reside on that drive. Even if their account was just a standard user account, which would not allow them to take ownership, if they were to remove the hard drive and attach it to another computer on which they do have an administrative account, then once again they could take ownership of all files and gain access to the data. Encryption, however, can be used to ensure that those situations don't occur, because encryption does not rely on the type of account you're using. It relies on the identity of each user. Now, the type of encryption that you can apply will depend on the device and the operating system it's running, but there are two basic levels of encryption: file level and drive level. File level encryption is used to apply encryption to either files or folders, but only those specified by the encrypting user will be encrypted. Now, if it's applied at the folder level, then all files in that folder become encrypted, but that's up to you. It can be applied to just a single file if you prefer. File level encryption is available and supported on systems running Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, but Windows is the only operating system that offers it by default, provided the hard drive you're using is formatted with NTFS, or the New Technology File System, which it almost certainly would be using. NTFS includes the encrypting file system feature, which can be used to apply file-level encryption by any administrative user, and nothing needs to be enabled or installed to use it. Simply right-click on any file or folder, then choose Properties. Then near the bottom of the Property window next to the File attributes, there is an Advanced button. Click that and enable the checkbox to encrypt the contents, and that's it. Only the user account who enabled the encryption will be able to access the data, and only that account can be used to remove the encryption, which is done simply by clearing the same checkbox. Linux and Mac OS don't offer it inherently, but there are various apps and services that can be installed on either platform to provide it. Disk-level encryption, as its name indicates, encrypts the entire contents of the hard drive, including all data, all system files, and all executables. Disk-level encryption cannot be implemented selectively like file-level, but it is still just an on-off feature like file-level encryption. It tends to be used more commonly on devices such as laptops because they're more susceptible to being lost or stolen, but it can certainly be applied to the hard drives of desktop systems as well to ensure that removing the hard drive and attaching it to another computer does not allow access to the data. And it's even supported on portable drives such as flash drives and external USB hard drives, including solid-state drives. For Windows computers, disk-level encryption is provided by the BitLocker feature. On Mac OS, it's provided by the File Vault feature, and on Linux, the Crypt Setup package can be used. Once again, BitLocker is included by default with Windows, but it does have to be at least the Pro edition. And File Vault is included with Mac OS, provided it's running 10.7 or OS X Lion or later, but Crypt Setup must be installed on Linux systems. Device encryption is also available for mobile devices, usually by default, provided a passcode is configured on the device. All data added to the device after configuring the passcode is automatically encrypted, and entering your passcode automatically and transparently decrypts the data so that it's always available to us as the authorized entity. However, if the passcode is disabled at any point, then so is the encryption. So be sure to keep your passcode enabled to ensure device security. Again, for data at rest, file level, disk level, or device level encryption can be used to ensure that your data is not accessed by any unauthorized entities, but like anything, no security measure is 100% effective. For example, if you enable encryption using your account, but I then discover your account credentials, I could of course sign in as you and remove any encryption that you've enabled, provided I can gain access to the device itself. So always make sure that you protect your account credentials as well whenever working with encryption. So in this course, we've examined basic concepts surrounding privacy and encryption. We did this by exploring social networking, email, file sharing, instant messaging, and software and network privacy, security and privacy policies and procedures, handling information and password best practices, the basics of computer encryption, and protecting data both at rest and in transit. In our next course, we'll move on to explore basic concepts surrounding authentication and disaster recovery.